Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study. My name is Matthew McGlade, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church. And every Tuesday night, we have our thought to think about, a question to ponder, and a text to study. And I want to thank Stephen Parker and also Philip Holmes for doing the Bible studies over the month of August. It's given me a bit of time to have a little bit of a break and enjoy a couple of weeks off and on holiday. So thank you guys for stepping in, and I trust you've all enjoyed their teaching and their ministry over these last few weeks. Now, what I want to do tonight is I just want to tie off a few loose ends to something I was starting before the summer break back towards the end of July. And you'll remember that during that time I was doing a series of studies on the trustworthiness of the Bible, why we can trust the Bible and why we can trust the Christian message. And the last few studies I did, we were looking at the importance of the identity of who Jesus is, that Jesus understood himself to be the Son of God, that he understood himself to be fully divine and fully human in one person. We looked at the evidence of his miracles, and we also looked at the importance of the evidence of his resurrection from the dead. Now, what I want to do tonight is just to finish that off. I want to look at maybe some of the objections that people may have towards the resurrection, because some people would think that surely supernatural things like people being raised from the dead, they don't happen on our world today. It breaks the laws of physics or science. And therefore, they'll try and maybe bring some suggestions or natural explanations to try and explain away the importance of the resurrection. And yet, for those of us here who are Christians tonight, we know the importance of the resurrection, because Christ's resurrection from the dead really is the linchpin and the foundation of our faith. The Christian faith and the Christian message stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. And so in the light of the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, which we looked at last week, we saw the evidence of the empty tomb, the testimony of the women, the historical belief that Jesus was the saviour of the world, the survival of the Jesus movement. All this is powerful evidence that Christ did indeed rise from the dead. How then do we respond to those people who try to make a counter argument and say that Christ didn't rise from the dead? And sometimes, more often than not, the arguments will fall into two categories. One is that the disciples were deceived into thinking that Jesus rose from the dead when he really didn't. And the other, worse still, is that the disciples were being deliberate deceivers. They were making a story up for their own self-promotion. So how can we respond to the skeptic? Well, firstly, I want to demonstrate to you this evening, firstly, that the disciples were not deceived. You know, one theory that has been put forward by one scholar is sometimes called the swoon theory. That is the idea that when Jesus was crucified on the cross, people thought he had died, but he hadn't really died, and was put into the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and then somehow in the cool of the tomb he managed to revive himself. He managed to push the tombstone out of the way, and then eventually convince his disciples that he was alive. Now, this really beggars belief, because from the extent of Jesus' injuries and the nature of what he experienced on the cross and the records of the gospel writers, it is very clear that Jesus truly did die on that cross. He had endured a Roman scourging. Records have shown that many people didn't even survive such a scourging. He was then crucified on the cross. And so it would have been medically impossible for Jesus even to recover from such a treatment if Jesus didn't die, as some tried to claim that he did. However, but to underline the point that Jesus really did die, in John's Gospel is recorded that a spear was thrust in his side, and there was a sudden flow of blood and water. And that is medical evidence of a ruptured heart, where there's a separation of the clot and the serum, showing that Jesus truly did die. So moreover, this suggestion that Jesus didn't die is really groundless. Okay, in fact, there's the evidence that Christ did die on that cross is profound, and thus his appearance to his disciples later on would have been proof and powerful evidence that he really did rise from the dead. And further, this idea, this swoon theory, we've got to believe that somehow that Jesus, after enduring all these injuries, pushed a heavy tombstone, fought past a Roman guard to convince the disciples that he really had died, doesn't really hold sway at all. Another theory that's been put forward that suggests that the disciples were deceived is that the women, when they went to the tomb of Jesus, they got the tombs mixed up. They went to the wrong tomb. They found that the tomb was empty, and as a result, they thought that Jesus was actually had risen from the dead. And maybe there was some got the gardener mixed up with Jesus, and as a result of that, they came to the false conclusion that Jesus had risen from the dead. This again does not hold sway, because the opponents of the message of Jesus would have been only all too happy to have shown the error of the women, and they would have gone to the tomb where Jesus was buried, and they would have found the body there. And so that really doesn't hold sway whatsoever. In addition, the burial of Jesus is actually one of the most historic attested facts in history. 6 separate sources show very clearly where Jesus was buried, and everyone knew where Jesus was buried. Again, another theory that has been put forward has been the idea that when Jesus was buried, that Joseph of Arimathea moved Jesus' body from his tomb to the common graveyard. But again, Joseph of Arimathea would have pointed out any error or any mistake on part of the disciples to show that actually Jesus was moved. He was buried somewhere else. And in addition, the Jewish leaders and the religious leaders would have used a different argument rather than the disciples stealing the body to try to explain why there was an empty tomb. They would have said that Joseph of Arimathea moved the body. And so this idea that somehow that the disciples were deceived doesn't really hold sway. Everyone knew where Jesus was buried, and if anyone wanted to try to disprove that the tomb was empty, they could have quite easily shown Jesus' body elsewhere. Some have suggested maybe the disciples were hallucinating, that they were actually having visions of Jesus, and as a result of that, they believed somehow that Christ had risen from the dead. Again, this does not hold sway, because anyone who does have any sort of hallucinations of a loved one after they died don't believe that they've actually risen from the dead. They are more likely to think that maybe that person is gone to the afterlife than risen from the dead. Further, people who are prone to having hallucinations normally are those who are highly strung, and that certainly does not fit the category of the disciples. They were burly, cynical fishermen. You see this particularly at the end of Mark's Gospel in their response to the women when they told them that Jesus was alive. They just disregarded the testimony of the women. They thought it was nonsense because they were just very much a cynical bunch. And so the idea that somehow that these disciples, these men, were somehow deceived because they got a tomb mixed up or they were having hallucinations doesn't add up. In fact, one scholar says this, that if the defeated and depressed group of disciples overnight could change into a victorious movement of faith based only on auto-suggestion or self-deception without any fundamental faith experience of seeing or experiencing the risen Christ, then this really would have been a greater miracle than the resurrection itself. And so clearly the disciples were not deceived. But further, they were not deceivers. You know, some have suggested that maybe the disciples stole the body and lied about the resurrection appearances of Jesus, and they sort of faked or staged a resurrection to demonstrate that he really did rise from the dead. In fact, this was the idea that was put forward by the Jewish leaders. You remember the story at the end of Matthew's Gospel, when the Roman soldiers saw the angel remove the tombstone from the tomb. They said to the religious leaders that what they experienced. And the religious Pharisees said to the Roman soldiers, just say that while he was asleep at night, the disciples came and stole the body. And so that was the argument that was even put forward by the religious leaders of the day. But the reality is this: what did the disciples have to gain in making up such a story, in stealing the body and making up a story that he rose from the dead? If they stole the body of Jesus, why did they use women as their first-hand eyewitnesses? Such a tale would not have convinced a first-century Jewish men. Why didn't they make up a much more glamorous story of Jesus' resurrection, like the visions of Daniel in his account in the book of Daniel of the Son of Man coming in glory, in majesty? And further, there was no expectation amongst this defeated group of men, after they've seen their teacher and leader die a horrendous death on the cross, that somehow their Messiah, their leader, would rise from the dead. There was no expectation, let alone that the Jewish Messiah would die on the cross, that he would rise from the dead. And further, what did the disciples gain in making such an elaborate hoax? Most of them, if not all of them, died a martyr's death. In fact, Blaise Pascal puts it this way: the idea that the apostles were liars or deceivers is quite absurd. Follow it out to the end, and imagine these 12 men meeting after Jesus' death and conspiring to say that they had seen Jesus rise from the dead. This means that they would have been they've been susceptible to all sorts of issues. The heart is singly susceptible to fickleness, to change, to promises, to bribery. One of them had only to deny his story under these inducements, or still more because of possible imprisonment, tortures and death, and they would have all have been lost. And so this notion that somehow they not only were deceived, but they were deceivers, really doesn't hold sway when we look at the evidence. And so, as I mentioned earlier on, the central linchpin of the Christian faith and message is Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And so we've seen prior to the August period that we've seen that Jesus, the events of Jesus' life, death, burial and resurrection truly are historically reliable, and therefore we can have confidence in the Christian message that it is a true message. We've seen that the Bible is a trustworthy source of truth, that we can build our faith upon it. And what we're going to do next week is that we're going to just start a new series, and we're going to be looking at, is the Bible more than just a human work? Or does God actually speak to us through the Scriptures? And we're going to be looking at the inspiration of Scriptures and the authority of Scriptures for our lives. Guys, that's our thought to think about. A question to ponder tonight is, how would you respond to someone who says that the resurrection of Jesus was made up by Jesus' followers? So how would you respond to someone who says that the resurrection of Jesus was a story that was made up by his followers? And the text of study, I'd like you to read Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 to 15. What was a story the soldiers were told to make up to explain the empty tomb? What was a story the soldiers were told to make up to explain the empty tomb? Guys, thanks for listening. Listen, have a great rest of the evening, and looking forward to seeing you on Sunday. God bless you all.